It's a privilege to get to continue this series that we are camping out in for most of our summer called Greater Things, the miracles of Jesus in the Gospel of John. And during this series, we're tapping in to John's Gospel specifically to guide us into a space of exploration, of expectation, of imagination, as we look at the specific miracles and signs that the Apostle John captures in his gospel. And as we keep in mind looking at the words of Jesus that John shared with us at the end of his gospel, right before Jesus' death and resurrection, in which John captures Jesus telling his followers that he would do or that they would do even greater things than him because of the power of Holy Spirit at work within us. Now, a few weeks ago, Curtis kicked us off in this series by sharing a little bit of his own story and by challenging us to be open to new ways that the Spirit might want to work in us, in new ways that the Spirit might want to move through us. And then Christian got us started off with the signs by looking at the miracle in John 2 of Jesus turning water into wine. And last week, Steve kept us going by sharing about Jesus healing the royal official's son in John 4 by just speaking words. And so today we dive in to this next miracle, which immediately follows last week's passage. So we're going to take a look this morning at John chapter 5, verses 1 through 15. Feel free to open up a Bible or the app on your phone or follow along on the screen. I'm going to be reading this morning from the New Living Translation. Starting in verse 1, afterward, Jesus returned to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish holy days. Inside the city, near the sheep gate, was the pool of Bethesda, with 5 covered porches. Some of your translations may say porticos or colonnades. Verse 3, crowds of sick people, blind, lame, or paralyzed, lay on the porches. And one of the men lying there had been sick for 38 years. When Jesus saw him and knew he had been ill for a long time, he asked him, "Would you like to get well?" Verse 7, "I can't, sir," the man said, "for I have no one to put me into the pool when the water bubbles up. Someone else always gets there ahead of me." Jesus told him, "Stand up, pick up your mat, and walk." Instantly, the man was healed, and he rolled up his sleeping mat and began walking. But this miracle happened on the Sabbath. So the Jewish leaders objected. They said to the man who was cured, "You can't work on the Sabbath. The law doesn't allow you to carry that sleeping mat." But he replied, "The man who healed me told me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" "Who said such a thing as that?" they demanded. Verse 13, the man didn't know, for Jesus had disappeared into the crowd. But afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and told him, "Now you are well. So stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." And then that man went and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had healed him. So this is the story that we are camping out in today. And it begins by saying afterward, or in some translations, after this, Jesus went to Jerusalem for a festival. And so we know that this takes place after what had just happened that Steve talked about last week. And we know that it takes place around the time of a festival. Now, there's a lot of debate on what festival this was. Honestly, it probably doesn't really matter, because if John had wanted us to know, he would have told us which feast this was. John, at times, named feasts when Jesus was going to Jerusalem. because it mattered, and what Jesus was talking about or his actions were specifically tied to that feast. This time, the only reason we know there was a feast was probably because John was giving us the reason that Jesus went to Jerusalem. A lot of Jesus' ministry was not performed directly in Jerusalem. He spent a lot of his time in other regions, particularly up in Galilee. And so it gives us a context for why Jesus went to Jerusalem. And so, he tells us, okay, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for a Jewish festival. And then he gives us a little bit more about the location. And so I want us to talk about the location and the setting for this story for a moment, because I think it's an important piece of the story. Now, first, you're going to notice, depending on what translation you might be looking at, that there are different names sometimes referenced for this particular place. Some call it Bethesda, others Bethzatha, or Belzetha, or Bethsaida. These are all different names, and they all have slightly different meanings. Many of them are variations of similar words, but many texts suggest that the word Bethesda means either house of mercy or house of grace. Other manuscripts seem to indicate that the name Bethesda is a derivative of the Hebrew word, which means place of overflowing water. No matter the interpretation that comes from it, there's a very similar meanings there. Bethesda is likely the best version of this that we have, in part because when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found and the copper scroll was examined in 1960, the name in that earliest manuscript that we have is Bethesda. So many modern translations use Bethesda, but some of them use others of these. For example, if you ever read the NET translation, it says Bethzatha in that translation. So, just to give you an idea, but this is all referring to this same place. And what's really fascinating is that it wasn't until the 19th century that scholars could identify where this specific place was. They had been thinking about it and looking for this for years, but they couldn't locate this specific miracle because they couldn't find the pool. Some people even began to think that this might be evidence that this gospel was written later by someone without firsthand knowledge of the city during Jesus' time. So maybe this wasn't written by John. Others believed that John's description must have metaphorical meaning rather than historical meaning, because John describes what's essentially a 5-sided pool, and that's just weird, right? How many of you, you've seen a lot of 5-sided pools? Not many of us. It's a weird shape for a pool. And so this thought was like, okay, maybe 5 is symbolic. We know numbers matter. Okay, what's 5? Oh, 5 is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch. So John must have this reference to the Jewish Torah, and that's why he's talking about 5 colonnades or 5 porticos. But then the overthinking was put aside because archaeological evidence discovered that there was, in fact, a site that matched this description. Some folks were digging in the late 1800s, 19th century, and then later, much more significantly, in the 20th century, in the 1900s, a site near what's called Church of St. Anne, which is in the northeast quarter of the Old City, near what Nehemiah called the Sheep's Gate. And the Sheep's Gate was called that because it's where the sheep entered, right? So when they had to bring in sacrificial lambs into the temple compound for the sheep markets, they came in through this gate. So Nehemiah called it the Sheep Gate. This location currently, if you're familiar at all with Jerusalem, the city's divided into quarters, and the Muslim quarter of the city is where this location is. And as this location has been excavated off and on over the past 150 years, it's helped us understand this site even more because layers of history have been unearthed that explains why it was hidden. So I want to show you a couple quick photos to help us understand. The first is a drawing, and I meant to bring a laser pointer so I could be cool like Jim. And in fact, I think it's probably in my bag. But you'll get the gist. So this is a rendering of what it could have looked like. But you see there's these two sort of pools, an upper pool and a lower pool, because it's built on a slope, because Jerusalem's on a hill. And it's got porticos on the sides, and then there's one right in the middle that divides the larger area into two sections. So there are 5 sides here. And so this is an idea of what it would look like with a northern pool and a southern pool. And in between them, on top, there's the portico kind of colonnade section on top, but below that was a dam that helped the water flowing between them. Bible scholars believe that this pool of Bethesda was used throughout history for ritual baths. So the pool sometimes is referred to as a mikveh or a mikvah, which refers to a bath used to achieve ritual purity. And so the next slide shows us, and this is kind of dark, I apologize for that, but this is a picture of a map essentially around that area. And what this shows us is that layers of settlers continued building on top of the pools. So when the Romans occupied the city in the 1st through 3rd centuries, they built, so to the right side, and you can't barely see the little bit of yellow there, but they built their own set of medicinal baths there. And so they're called these pagan medicinal baths. And there was a pagan temple near that pool site as well that occurred. Now, later than that, the area was conquered again, and during the Byzantine period, and that's what's in the red, they built a large basilica that covered the pagan baths as well as parts of the pools. So there was this Byzantine kind of structure there. And then the Crusaders came in, and they were like, you know what? We see what you've done. We're going to raise it. And they built a church over in the corner, and then they built a chapel right in the middle of that. Now, in the far bottom right corner, that blue you see there, that's the corner of St. Anne's Church, which was constructed probably sometime between 1131 and 1138. So you can see this is 1,000 years later, but things are continuing to be built on this site. Now, it was during the 1800s that in St. Anne's, the area where St. Anne's Church is, some artifacts were uncovered that led them to believe this is where the healing pool was. And there's like a white stone that actually was on display at the Louvre Museum for a long time that they took from this site. And it was still later, almost 100 years later, that a German archaeologist who was based in Jerusalem unearthed what was the larger pool-like structure that showed the features similar to the one described in John's gospel. And so the archaeologists discovered 4 porticos around the outside, and then they found the 5th one down the middle. And he commented in his writings that some sections of the pool seemed like they were up to 40 feet deep, but other areas of the pools were shallower, and there was these different caverns. And so they realized when they uncovered it, this is the spot. These 5 different sides, this is the hidden pool of Bethesda that, some didn't think existed. And so I want to show you a couple more photos. These photos I took on a trip in 2019. And so when you're looking at it today, this is what you kind of look at. And you can see there's layers upon layers of building there. And in this kind of middle bottom section towards the right, there's like a square-looking well. And when you zoom in, this is what it shows you. And there's a little plaque there. And it says, Jesus healed the sick man near these medicinal baths in John 5. And so that's not like the exact spot. They're just, kind of helping you see. There's some other labels in the pictures that kind of tells you like, oh, this was a Roman wall. This was St. Anne's Church, some of these different things. But if you go there now, this is kind of what you see. And you can see how it's layer upon layer. But underneath all of those layers are these pools. And it's at that location in these pools where we get this story. So what was special about these pools in this location? Well, these twin pools were fed by some large reservoirs called Solomon's Pools, and it's believed that they also were likely fed by some intermittent springs that were located beneath them under the earth. And so what would happen is that there would be this, the intermittent springs would cause water to be flow into these pools, and the water would move. So a legend was formed that the angels would stir the pool, and that's why the water would move. And whenever this happened, the first person into the water would be healed, no matter the ailment. So in some of your translations, you have a verse 4. In a lot of translations, it skips from verse 3 to verse 5, like what I read this morning, and you may not have even noticed. But if you look at the footnote in a lot of translations, you'll see that it looks something like this. So verse 3, here a great number of disabled people used to lie, the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. And this is from the NIV. And then the footnote sends you to this remaining part in verse 4, after the word paralyzed. And they waited for the moving of the waters. From time to time, an angel of the Lord would come down and stir up the waters. The first one into the pool after each such disturbance would be cured of whatever disease they had. So at some point, and different manuscripts have this verse and others don't, and some of the older ones don't, which is why it's been removed from many of our modern Bibles. And that's where things like the Dead Sea Scrolls became really important to the text. But the thought is, at some point, somebody added this in because they needed to explain why were all of these crowds hanging out by these pools. And so they wanted to explain, well, it was because at that time, and especially because the pools had been covered up and layered up, that there was this need to explain what was the belief. Also, the need to give it some type of divine presence, because right after the time of Jesus, these pools were overtaken by Roman occupation, and they were used as pagan healing pools. And the thought was that the earliest believers didn't want to be associated with pagan beliefs, so they needed to explain the legend that the divine cause, that it was the angel, it was God at work, and that's why all of these diseased folks were by the pool. So that's just a little bit of background and setting, and I think that helps set the stage for what we have. So as we continue into the interaction, we see John tell us that there were a great number of sick people who laid by these pools. The New Living Translation translates it as crowds of people. The English Standard Version says, in these lay a multitude of invalids. So we get the idea. It was a lot of people, crowds of people, multitudes of sick people were here. And then John tells us that Jesus, in this huge crowd of sick people, he identifies one sick man, a man who had been an invalid for 38 years. Now that's almost 4 decades. All right, so how many of you in this room are like around 20 years or less? Who are our 20-year and under people? All right, there's a few of you in this room. So for you all, this is like over twice your lifetime, or close to twice your lifetimes, depending on how close to 20 you are. Now, I'm not going to ask how many of us in this room are older than 38, but that's a number of us in this room. I'm not ashamed to say I'm 40, almost 46. And so, thinking about 38 years, though, that's still a long time. Like, that feels like a lot of my life to me, 38 years. This is a long, long time to be an invalid. And some of us, we understand issues that last a long, long time. We understand things that seem like it's been going on forever. Struggles that we've had, issues that we've had. It might be a physical challenge or an illness. It might be a relational challenge. But there are things that feel like They are never going to end. And what can happen when we're in something for a long time? It doesn't have to be 38 years long. It could be 3 years long. But what happens when something's been going on for a long time, an issue, a struggle, is that we can start to identify with that and lose sight of the possibility for change. Especially if we spend all of our time around people who are struggling with similar issues. And it can be easy in those types of situations for the issue to become our identity. Now, I'm going to say this next part carefully, and I want to preface it by saying many of you know my primary occupation is as a mental health counselor. I'm licensed in a couple different states, and I work with a caseload of clients on a regular basis. And so I spend a lot of time with people who have issues and who are working through things. And some of my clients have very extensive situations that they are working through, and they have been for a long time. They've gone through lots and lots of things. And so I'm not saying what I'm about to say without compassion, but I feel like it needs to be said. And that's that it can be easy in certain situations for our issues to become our identity. And when that happens, we have to be careful, because without realizing it, the culture begins to form that unintentionally embraces brokenness, and we can become comfortable with what ails us. And we lose our imagination for how Jesus wants to transform us because we lose our hope. I have a counseling client who's not that old. She's a young single woman in her 20s. She doesn't live in Virginia, but she is in ministry. It's her full-time job. And we've been talking recently, and she shared with me how she was struggling with depression. And she told me how sometimes she struggles with feeling this temptation to want to stay depressed, because in reality, she's found that it draws other people to reach out to her, to show her compassion and empathy, even show her pity at times. But that type of care and love and attention that she receives, it can be comfortable and it can feel really nice. And now she's working hard to not live that way, but she confessed the temptation. And, I told her when she told me that, that's a normal struggle, I think, for a lot of people. If you and I are honest, we can relate to that. There are times where we find ourselves in a situation and it just feels easier to stay in the brokenness. It feels more comfortable to accept this is just the way that it is. Things aren't going to change. This is just how God made me, or this is the way that it is. I think, Steve pointed out even last week that statement, it is what it is, right? This is it. And we accept it on this level. And before we realize it, that becomes part of our identity that we've just worked in there. And I think this man is an example of that, and where he had lost his identity and his issue had become who he was. And I'll explain that more in a moment. But this man was so used to lying down on a mat that he didn't remember what it was like to not be on it, because he'd been there for 38 years. For 38 years. And so his perspective was entirely based on what he saw from that mat. And it's in this place that Jesus meets him. In this crowd of invalids, Jesus singles out this one guy who's been on a mat for 38 years, and he goes up to him, and he does something that's a bit strange. He doesn't show obvious compassion, which is, I think, what we might expect of Jesus, or maybe somebody who's acting pastorally. I'm so sorry. How can I help you? What can I do for you? Meeting them where they are. But Jesus goes up to this man and he says, do you want to get well? The ESV reads, do you want to be healed? That's what Jesus asks this man. I heard author and Bible teacher Christine Caine speak on this passage at a conference once, and she joked about how if this happened nowadays, Jesus would be fired if he were a pastor. She said, have you ever stopped to think about how unpastoral his actions seem in the moment? She suggested that, what people kind of expect of love and compassion is this just full acceptance of where you are and this you be you mentality. She joked, I think people wanted Jesus to go up next to him and be like, you do you, boo. I'm going to join you in this place and be there. But that's not what Jesus does. Jesus says, do you want to be healed? And so she joked that if people had their phones out and they were recording this would have gone viral with the hashtag mean Jesus. Hashtag no compassion Jesus. Hashtag Jesus doesn't understand, because it feels a little off, if we're honest. Like this person is clearly at this pool where they have been probably for most of this 38 years. And they're laying there at the pool because it's known for healing. And he's going to go up to this person who's by a pool for healing, clearly an invalid, and be like, well, do you want to be healed? And that can seem like it's not compassionate. But the truth is, the Jesus that we see here is showing compassion, showing love, because he wants something different for this man. He has a different perspective. He has a different future he hopes for this man. And then we get to the man's answer. And this blows my mind every single time that I read this passage, because the man doesn't answer yes. Like what? Do you want to be healed? You're by a pool for healing. You think the answer would be yes, but that's not what the man says. And this is how we know that his issue had become his identity, because he answers in two ways that are common for someone who's kind of just given up hope and accepted their fate. First, he says, I can't. I can't. I have no one to help me into the pool when the water is stirred. See that second part? That's where he blames others for not helping him, and then he points out how everyone else gets in first. I can't. No one helps me, and then everyone else is already in the water. Someone always gets there first. Someone always. So I want us to pause right now for a moment and think. Let's think about our own lives. Let's think about our own situations. Let's think about those closest to us. But is there a mat that we are laying on? What is our mat? Is there a condition, an issue, a struggle that we've had in our lives that we've come to identify with, that we've let become just part of who we are? Is there something that God might be wanting to heal in us or change in us that we just think, I can't? Is there something that we can't even think about without pointing to other people and saying, it's their fault, or they always get this first, or this never happens for me, but it does for them? Is there something like that we put our eyes on others instead of what God might be wanting to speak to us? So let's keep reading. How does Jesus respond to this man? Well, here Jesus goes again, being a little unpastoral. He tells this invalid man, this paralyzed man, who has just said he can't, to get up, pick up your mat, and walk. Talk about mean Jesus here, right? Can you imagine today if a pastor walks into a room full of people who are paralyzed, and he picks one of them out, and he's like, stand up? That might seem like it's lacking compassion, and that's pretty much what Jesus did here. But what's so incredible is that for some reason this time it clicks. This man who had been there for 38 years lying on this mat. This man that when Jesus says, do you want to get well? He says, I can't. This man who's just said, I can't. Jesus says, get up, pick up your mat, and walk. And he does. That is a miracle in more than one way. Yes, his legs and his body are healed. There's this physical healing that happens. But even more than that, this man's mind and his soul and his faith are healed. And to me, in some ways, that's the bigger miracle. I love how this story comes to a close. Because this story steps on our toes in some way. Most of us in this room, I'm guessing none of us in this room have spent 38 years paralyzed lying on a mat, unable to move. But we can relate to a lot of pieces of this story. And I think we can relate to this man's feeling of resignation. I can't do it. But when Jesus speaks these words to this man, get up, pick up your mat, and walk, this man experiences healing. Healing that runs deep. Healing that, yes, allows him to walk, but healing that is within. And at that point, this man's identity becomes separated away from that mat again. But this is what I love about that story. Jesus doesn't just say, get up and walk. He tells him to pick up his mat. He doesn't tell him to leave the mat behind. He says, pick up your mat and walk. And why does Jesus do this? I believe that it's because this thing that the man had come to identify with, this mat that had become part of his identity, Jesus didn't tell him to leave it fully behind. Yes, it no longer defined him, but it did mark him. And now it was a different part of his story. It was redeemed. That mat became a testimony. I imagine the whole way home, people saw the man with the mat and either realized who he was or asked him. Well, we know that the leaders asked him, why are you carrying that mat? We're not going to get into that whole, okay, this dude literally just got healed after 38 years and you're worried about the fact that he's carrying his mat on the Sabbath. We're not going to get into that today. But he's carrying this mat. People are going to notice. They're going to ask him about that mat. And he gets this chance to share his story. And that mat marks him because it's part of his story, but it doesn't define him. It's not his whole story. I mean, can't you picture it at some point? He's walking and he sees somebody else on their mat. And can't you picture how he could lean next to this person and say, I understand what it's like to be on that mat. Here's my mat. I was there for 38 years. I know what it's like, but don't lose hope. Because what God did for me, he can do for you too. You see my mat? Don't lose hope, because yours could be rolled up one day like mine. So as we close this morning, I want us to think again about our own situations. And this time, I want us to picture ourselves with that mat that we have, that issue that we have, that struggle that we have, the thing that's been holding us back, the insecurity, whatever it is that's been holding us back. I want us to picture us with that thing not being our whole story, but just a part. I want us to picture what it would be like for Jesus to heal us. I want you to close your eyes for a moment, and I want you to envision, what would it look like for that thing that you've been stuck with to be gone? Can you dream about that? Friends, I believe that as you're thinking about that thing in your life, I believe Jesus is calling to us the same way he was speaking to this man. I believe he's asking us, do you want to get well? Do you want to be healed? I think he wants to say to us the same thing that he told this man. Get up, pick up your mat, and walk with me. Friends, he promised that we would do greater things because the Holy Spirit is living in us. That means miracles are possible. It means healing is available. Are we open to imagining it? Are we open to pursuing it? Are we open to trusting him that when he says get up, we can, even if we've always thought that we can't? Would you pray with me? God, we ask this morning that you would continue to invite us to dream, invite us to imagine, invite us to look for you in the midst of the things that are hard, that seem impossible. In the crowd of the multitudes, God, would we picture you finding us in that crowd, just like you found this one man? And would we embrace your presence with us as you encourage us, as you challenge us, as you show us compassion, but not compassion that leaves us in our brokenness, compassion that draws us out of that, whatever that healing might look like. God, we know and trust and believe that for those of us that believe in you, that you have redeemed us and that we'll spend eternity with you in heaven, we believe that whatever limitations we have on this earth, you will heal those in heaven. But God, we also know that you allow a lot of that healing to also take place here on this earth. And so, God, we ask you for it. We want to believe you for it. We want to keep our hope up for it. In whatever way and whatever tools you might use in this lifetime to do so. God, the only reason people were by that pool in the first place was because at some point somebody had to have been healed in those waters, or else that many people wouldn't have been hanging out by those pools. And we know that there's historical records of people talking about this reddish water that was in those pools, and people experienced healing. And God, we believe that you want to still heal today. And so we're not putting that past you, God, for physical healing. But God, would you heal all of us? Would you heal our faith in the places that we doubt? Would you give us courage to believe and trust that you are at work in us and through us and among us? God, you are able. Would you help us to pick up our mats and walk? I pray this in your name. Amen.